It's Thursday, September 12, 2013. Today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Go to audiblepodcast.com/iMore for your free audiobook download. I'm Rene Ritchie, and right now we're going to be talking to you about Apple's brand new flagship iPhone 5S and colorful new, less expensive iPhone 5C. This is the iMore Show. Peter, you are here, the executive editor of The Loop and the managing editor of iMore.com. Peter Cohen, how are you, sir?
I am well, Rene. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. We're also joined by the senior editor of iMore and editor-at-large for Mobile Nations, our very own version of The Stig, Richard Devine. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, Rene. Good to be back.
I got Tim Cook behind me, but unfortunately I forgot to mute him, so I apologize. I'm going to just turn this volume. There. Now, I don't have to hear Tim Cook talking about the Gaga. I can just see him. So we had the iPhone event. We covered it live. We had thousands upon tens of thousands, almost 100,000 people watching the video, almost 1 million people joining us on iMore for it. It was quite a day. I'd like to dive a little bit more deeply into it, and especially hear what Richard has to say, because Peter and I, got to do a lot of it live, but Richard was manning the blog posts back home. So let's start off. Is it fair, Richard, to say that this is the most competitive market that Apple's ever entered? What with the quality of phones, everyone from Android to BlackBerry to Windows Phone is putting on the market now?
I think that's a very fair statement. It doesn't matter which platform you look at anymore. There's a really good quality handset to choose from on all of them. So, I mean, Windows Phone's got the Lumia devices. Android's got things from HTC and Samsung. BlackBerry's got the Z10 and the Q10, which might be their only sort of two devices, but they're still pretty good quality. So it's a
two
really
more they had last year.
Kind of, but it's a really you're right. It's a really, really competitive market, and it's going to be tough out there. It really is.
So, Peter, I mean, my general buying advice for people, and when I say people, I don't mean internet nerds and geeks who know every... civilians, muggles, whatever you'd like to call them, is buy an iPhone unless you have a reason not to buy an iPhone. For example, if you need a bigger screen and only, or you want more customization and only Android can give it to you, or you want a giant 42-megapixel camera and it's only on the Lumia, or you want a physical keyboard and it's only on the BlackBerry. But I still think for most people, most of the time, the iPhone is still the default mainstream smartphone.
It's interesting. I have to admit, I really don't have any skin in the game if people buy an iPhone or not. So if people ask me, for a recommendation overall, I'm really reluctant to tell them to go out and get an iPhone specifically until I listen to what they have to say. And I mean, the iPhone is certainly the right phone for a lot of people. But the market is the smartphone market is crowded with pretty decent products these days, regardless of which operating system you pledge your allegiance to.
Richard, what advantage if someone asked you what phone should they get? At what point would you say maybe don't get an iPhone and get something else?
I would probably start with screen size because I myself I'm quite fond of a smaller screen size, but it does seem to be an increasing demand. There seems to be a lot of people who are getting really behind these kind of bigger screen phones. Some people see it as an intermediary between carrying a phone and a tablet. Let's get a giant phone, so I only have to carry one device. So, I mean, that'd be one of the first places I started. If you want a big screen, you're going to have to look somewhere else. But after that, I mean, it's very difficult to think of something specific that the iPhone does not do that the other platforms really do. You mentioned the giant camera on the Lumia, and you mentioned that bits and pieces, but generally, if you want an all-round good experience, the iPhone is still one of the first phones to suggest to people.
So this year, unlike previous years, we've gotten 2 new iPhones. Up until now, Apple had the habit of keeping around the previous year's iPhone, dropping that $100, keeping around sometimes even the 2-year-old iPhone, dropping that down to $0 on contract. This year, the iPhone 5 totally disappeared, and they released a much easier to manufacture iPhone 5C in 5 colors: pink, green, yellow, blue, and white, and the new high-end iPhone 5S. Peter, quick thoughts between the two. How do you see them positioned?
Well, in years past, Apple has typically knocked down the flagship model to also ran status, and it has sold it at a discount alongside the new shiny thing. This year, Apple's taking a different approach, and it has excised the 5 altogether. The 5 has become an unperson. The 5 is the iPad 3. It is the device that
Disavowed.
no longer. That's exactly it. It's been stricken from the books. And in fairness, I mean, there's certainly a lot of 5 inventory out there at the moment, and retailers who have them are discounting them like crazy to get them out of the stores. So if you want a 5, you can pick up a good deal on one right now if you're starting up with a 2-year plan or what have you. But the iPhone 5C is being promoted as the new mainstream phone for people who are looking for a better value than they get with the iPhone 5S, for example. It is basically the iPhone 5 internally, but with this cool polycarbonate shell. And some people have knocked Apple for not doing anything different with the iPhone 5C inside than was really there with the 5. But you know what? The fact that it's in a shiny new shell is going to be reason enough for a lot of people who don't already have an iPhone 5 to upgrade. So I'm looking at it as a net positive, and I'm thinking that people are going to buy this thing in droves because it's only $100 on contract, and you can get it in 5 cool colors, and people like colors.
And it does have the only big internal improvement is it has a better quality FaceTime HD camera with a backside illuminated sensor. It was never, anyone who followed Apple for any amount of time knows that this was never going to be a cheap phone. Apple doesn't do cheap. They don't know how to make a $200 netbook, so they make the MacBook Air. They don't know how to make a $100 tablet, so they make the iPad Mini. They made the iPod Mini for the same reason. Richard, a lot of people were surprised by this. I thought it would be closer to $450 off contract than $550, but I don't think there was ever a chance they were going to compete with the $100 Android phones.
Definitely not. I think we've maybe been a victim of internet hype beasting a little bit, possibly. The term low cost has been thrown around far too much, but I mean, like you mentioned, Apple doesn't do cheap products. The Mac Mini is the lower cost Mac, because it comes without a screen. The iPad Mini is a lower cost iPad. The iPhone 5C is now a lower cost iPhone than the premium top of the line model. So I think the internet and the world as a whole maybe fell into the trap of plastic being cheap. Well, no, it doesn't. And Apple's obviously made a flagship phone before out of plastic. So I think people maybe were looking in places that just there wasn't anything to look.
So you've tried the plastic phones. I have too. I've always said I've never been a fan of Samsung's plastics. Always felt like Hasbro to me. I've loved Nokia's polycarbonate. I've loved HTC's polycarbonate. Apple did a pretty good job on the 3G and the 3GS, and this looks like it's even better because it has a steel frame inside it, so it won't even be mushy the way some plastic phones are.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing to notice. Plastic is plastic, but the important differentiator is polycarbonate over just plastic. And you mentioned Nokia and you mentioned HTC. I mean, I've got a Lumia 920 lying around somewhere, and that's a polycarbonate phone. It's essentially plastic, but it's a tank. You could throw it at things, and the things will disintegrate before the phone. So it's really strong and really sturdy. And you mentioned the 3GS. In no way did the 3G or the 3GS ever feel like a cheap phone. It was still an iPhone, still got the Apple logo on the back, and the screen on we're still getting the same Retina screen on the front. I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on this one because I'm quite excited by it actually.
So the other end of the spectrum is the iPhone 5S, the new high-end phone, the new flagship. It keeps the same design. They dropped the black color, which was hard to anodize. It was subject to more wear and tear than the white version, and they replaced it with space gray. They also added the gold iPhone, which we'd heard a lot about. But the big news here, Peter, was on the inside, and what interested me in particular is they went to a 64-bit. It looks like it's based on ARM V8 protocol. It's the second generation Swift core. Apple did their first custom Swift processor last year, and it's 64-bit. Apple called it desktop class, Peter.
Desktop class, yeah, desktop class processor. Now, the interesting thing about 64-bit, I mean, a lot of people have grabbed onto the fact, and I mentioned this during our podcast of the Apple event too, that 64-bit processors can address more than 4 gigabytes of RAM, and right now the iPhone doesn't have anywhere close to that, so that's not really a practical consideration for this, but it does let processors grab data in much bigger chunks than they could, and that comes in handy when you're doing things like processing images, which of course is very core to the iPhone's main use for a lot of people. I think it was Phil Schiller who said on stage at the Apple event this week that camera improvements are the number one thing that iPhone users request. So, getting under the hood there, that 64-bit processor is going to mean a lot further down the road as developers get on board with it, as they optimize their software for 64-bit processors, and as they can see what it can do. The nice thing is that Apple is giving them a very easy way of adopting that. It's built into the iOS 7 developers tools that are out in the world now. That transition should be pretty easy for them. And if Donald Mustard from Chair Entertainment, who demoed Infinity Blade 3, is any indication, it's not going to be a big deal. He said it took them just a couple of hours to get their code working on a 64-bit processor. So that's great news.
I have heard, though, that Unreal 3 is 64-bit compliant. They probably switched the flag and did a couple other things. So
that's right. Well, exactly right. I mean, it's all going to depend on how your code is optimized, and clearly they're an edge case, but an important edge case, I think.
No, I agree. And one of the things that interests me is, Apple's got this reputation, earned or not earned, for not being innovative lately. And there was that famous Phil Schiller clip, not innovating my ass. Last year, not only did they come up with an amazingly innovative way to manufacture iPhones, something that has now gone into the 5C and the 5S, but last year they came up with their own chip. And they're one of the few companies doing the complete chip design, not just licensing or reference design. And this year they upped the stakes with 64-bit. And Richard, I know Samsung came out and said, well, we'll do 64-bit too. But the thing I like about Apple is that they never think in terms of chipsets, but they think in terms of feature sets. And like Peter said, this will allow developers to address far more registers at once, so it makes their applications faster. Apple said twice as fast for general processing tasks, twice as fast for graphics tasks, considerably faster. I think it was like 40 times faster than the original iPhone. But it seems to me, Richard, that Apple's got very clear paths, not just with this device, but with their future roadmap for both Mac and iOS with these chipsets.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely playing the long game, and it was just a matter of which year did they implement it. It's perhaps more exciting for the future than it is right now. I mean, we saw Infinity Blade, a demo during the event. Now, just a quick word on that. I think it looks absolutely amazing. But it's like you say, they mentioned the specs, but it was more about this is what the developers are going to be able to do with it. So we've written iOS 7 to be 64-bit compliant, and this is how the developers are going to be able to hook into all this to make apps that are compliant with it and that hook into it all. And it's starting off a very exciting future. And you mentioned that the potential for desktop in the future, and I mean, who knows where it's going to go, but it's not. It's not going to end here. It's only the beginning. And I mean, you mentioned Samsung jumping on we're going to do it too. It's inevitable that they probably were going to, but given the timing, it's probably a better announcement for them this week than in 6 months' time. But I mean, I think they've got a lot more work to do in implementing 64-bit processors into their phones than obviously Apple does, because Apple controls everything.
Yeah, and they have the whole ecosystem, and I've heard for a while now that there's a Mac on ARM movement within Apple. It's been a project, I think, since at least 2011. And Peter, I mean, I can absolutely imagine, not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, a MacBook Air-like device running off a custom Apple ARM processor, 24 hours of battery life.
I am sure that Apple would love to unshackle itself from Intel as a chip provider because it forces Apple to work in lockstep with the rest of the PC industry when it comes to when it comes to new products. And let's face it, Apple can throw its weight around a little bit as a premier developer of personal computers to edge Intel into letting it get its hands on new chip designs early, and it's very good about innovating and getting that stuff out into the marketplace in a way that it can make a big splash. The Haswell-based MacBook Pros are a practical example. I can't think of a single PC manufacturer who got anything close to the attention that Apple did with the new MacBook Airs back in June, and everybody got their Haswell chips at the same time. Apple certainly throws its weight around with Intel, but Apple is one of many customers of Intel, many of whom produce products in greater quantities than Apple does when it comes to those devices. Having said that, the Macintosh is by any measure a sideline business for Apple now. Apple's main bread and butter, their main product line is iOS and the iOS devices that operate that software. So it makes sense at some point or another that the Macintosh is going to become more iOS device-like in terms of its internal componentry, and quite frankly, I can't wait for that to happen because, as you say, Rene, the idea of a 24-hour battery life on a MacBook Air is very appealing. But the question becomes, I guess, what will happen to Mac users who have become very comfortable with PC compatibility across the board? The ability to install Boot Camp and Parallels and Fusion.
They can run Windows RT.
there you go. Yeah, I guess that would be a possibility.
All right, so moving along, Peter mentioned the camera before, and Apple, absolutely since the iPhone 4, maybe even before that, with the iPhone 4, Steve Jobs came out and gave this very famous keynote speech where he said, it's not about the megapixels, it's about the photons. You want to capture the photons. And Phil Schiller at this event, he was still beating that drum, and Apple, they kept the 8-megapixel sensor, which is plenty. It's more than large enough for a phone. And instead of, just as a brief aside, when you make the megapixels bigger, usually you do it by cutting the sensor up into smaller pixels, which means each pixel captures less light, and you get a crappier picture. So Apple kept 8 megapixels and made the sensor slightly bigger, so they went from 1.4 microns to 1.5 microns. But to go back to the chipset, Apple's custom chipset means they can do a really fantastic image processing system, image signal processor inside the A7 chip, and that's letting them do all these things like matrix sharpening. It's letting them do burst mode photography where they capture the best image of any set. It's letting them do exposure across panoramas. It's letting them take what would be average photos given the glass and producing photos that are as good as high-end, Nokia camera phones that are more camera than phones. Richard, you did some 925 comparisons, and I still think, with this kind of, and they're not using optical image stabilization, but they're using automatic electronic image stabilization, Apple is keeping pace with the camera side as well.
Yeah, they're doing it a different way, but they're doing it their way. Some of the sample images that they flashed up during the event, they look pretty good. And you mentioned the megapixel race, and it's something HTC started out with earlier in the year with the HTC One. They cut the megapixels down to 4, but increased the microns. So it's
they're 2 microns now, I think.
I think theirs is 2. So Apple again they're doing it a different way, but they're not falling behind. I think it's important that they showed off what the camera can do rather than baffling us with science and and that's a really important, and again it's kind of key to the Apple experience. It's kind of cliched and it's not about the specs, but it is, as long as you can do something with it, and they're more concerned with how you're going to take these great photographs and what you can do with it afterwards than, for example, sticking a 13 megapixel camera on and calling it a day.
I agree with you, Richard, but it's a hard sell sometimes if you're talking to a spec monkey to explain to them that, yeah, it's still an 8 megapixel camera, but it's 8 better megapixels than it was before. It's just it's difficult to it's difficult to get your head around how the technology works to make it qualitatively better. I always go back to the old expression, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The image quality is the important thing here, not the number of megapixels. You can blow up an 8 megapixel picture if it's taken well to the size of a poster and nobody's going to know. But I have to admit, that did disappoint some people, and I can understand why. We've gotten very used to high megapixel counts. You've got products like the Lumia 1020 out in the world that, by any measure, take some really extraordinary photographs. So I think people were, right or wrong, they were understandably disappointed that the megapixel count wasn't higher in the 5S sensor than it is on the 5.
Yeah, I understand that. For me, I don't want to call it disappointment, but they went down from a 2.4 aperture, f-stop 2.4 to 2.2. I would have liked 2.0, like on the HTC One as well, because camera phones are doing that. I'm guessing they're still highly constrained by how thin and small the iPhone 5 platform is. Apple could have kept a thicker phone and gone with better optics, but they're prioritizing thinness. They also, I believe, the iPhone 5S got the same improvements, the backside illuminated sensor for the FaceTime camera. Another thing that disappointed a lot of people, Peter, perhaps yourself included, is that we didn't get the 128 gigabyte version that a lot of people were hoping for, and that historically Apple was in pattern step to do.
Yeah, I'm going to be very interested to see what they do for the iPod Touch, which is coming up on a refresh as well, which we didn't hear about this week.
Maybe it could just be getting gray. That might be it for this year.
Yeah, there you go. So I think the iPhone has become the principal music jukebox for a lot of people. This is not a new trend. If you take a look at the sales of iPods, they have decreased almost in lockstep with the increase of sales of the iPhone. People just want one phone to rule them all. So I think the 128 gig would have been nice for those of us like myself who like to carry their entire music library with them. Now, Apple is also obviously offering a solution in the form of iTunes Match and iTunes in the cloud. And that does work. It works after a fashion, but if you're on your cell carrier plan frequently, then you're using up your data allotment to do it, and it can be slow and kludgy and doesn't always work the way that you expect it to. For me, I like to pick up and go and make sure that regardless of how strong my signal is, I can listen to whatever music I want to. That's why I like the iPod Classic. I wish I could find mine. I haven't been able to find it.
Today's show is brought to you by Audible. You can go to audiblepodcast.com/iMore to get your free audiobook download. Audible provides almost every book you can imagine, new and old, bestseller and niche, hidden gem, and absolute must-read that you can imagine in audio form. Why listen to a book instead of read it? Well, I mean, the answer is simple. If you are traveling a lot, if you are commuting, and you want to listen to something fantastic, if you want to be swept away by historical events, if you want to hear the latest, fiction bestseller, then you really want Audible, because they will read you the books as you travel. Or if you're like me and you spend all your time staring at a computer screen, the last thing that your eyes have energy left to do is to read a book. And that might sound sad, that might sound like you're missing out, but thanks to Audible, you really aren't. So whether it's Neil Gaiman's brand new book, or whether it's the biography of that historical figure you've always heard of, whether it's any of the fantastic Steve Jobs books that are on the market, or whether it's J.K. Rowling's secret new detective story, all you have to do is go to Audible. You can get recommendations, you can find amazing stuff, and you can fill what would otherwise be tedious or empty moments with something enjoyable, educational, or just simply enthralling. Once again, just go to Audible. That's audiblepodcast.com/iMore, and you can get a free credit for a free audiobook download.
So obviously the biggest differentiator is what Apple is calling Touch ID, and that is this fingerprint sensor. Apple bought Authentic a couple of years ago. There have been rumors, to the point of obviousness that they're going to be doing this. Apparently, they did tons of testing beforehand, and the way it works is this: they have a sapphire lens on top of the home button. You touch that lens. There's still a physical trigger, like on any iPhone, and when that trigger is hit, it will unlock. It'll turn on the phone the same way the home button used to. It's got a metal ring around the outside, color matched to space gray or gold or silver, that detects the fingers there and turns on the reader. And then it's got a high-resolution capacitive fingerprint reader. And we were expecting it to unlock the phone. Apple is also going to let it authenticate you for iTunes purchases. It's not going to be available. There's no API they've announced yet. It doesn't do consumer transactions like Passbook or anything, Richard. But I think it's interesting that Apple has taken the step to bring security to the mainstream the way they did backups and stuff like with Time Machine.
Absolutely, and I couldn't be happier that they're integrating it with iTunes. That was I think I spoke about it a few weeks ago before the event, and that was the one big thing that I hoped they were going to do with it if they were going to put a fingerprint scanner in. I have a ridiculously long iTunes password, and being able to put my thumb over the home button and buy stuff, I'm keen to try it now. But it looks like it's been well implemented. They've given it a kind of consumer-friendly name with Touch ID, and it looks really easy to set up. And like you say, it's very mainstream. It's not kind of there's been phones in the past that have used a fingerprint scanner, like the Motorola Atrix, but it was kind of geeky and kind of shoddy, and it didn't.
It was the old swipe-based sensor that barely worked.
Yeah, and it didn't really work. So ultimately we've only got Apple's word for how well it does work on the 5S and how long it will continue to work. But I'm optimistic, and I am actually really kind of keen to get using it now.
The people who were in the room, and we spoke to Andy Anatko on MacBreak about it, and some people have written about it, said that it worked really, really well. Apple does caution that if you've got any type of scarring on your finger, it can interfere with it, or a lot of sweat can interfere with it. But you can enable up to 5 fingerprints, either yours or different members of your families. And what I thought interesting, Peter, but maybe not so interesting given the climate, is they really went to town on it's secure, it's not stored on the cloud, it's not synced with iCloud, it's held in this special quadrant of the A7 chip, and it's only accessible from that chip to the sensor.
Yeah, and you know what's bizarre about it is that despite that, rumors have come out that the NSA can read your phone even, if the data isn't on the cloud. So people are like, yeah, whatever. The NSA is rubbing its hands in glee at having the largest fingerprint database ever assembled by man. Whatever. You know what? If that is your biggest concern about security, you have your head in your ass.
So I will say, because I tend towards the paranoid. I mean, some people will put tape over their webcams because you never really know when your webcam is on or not. For me, this is the same thing. If you're the kind of person who worries about whether your webcam is on or not, or whether the microphone on your phone is being turned on without your permission, you're certainly entitled to worry about this, and you could probably put an opaque sticker over the home button to prevent it from reading anything it's not authorized to read. I've gone on.
Or better yet, just put it in an OtterBox, and then the home button's going to be covered anyway.
Absolutely, or stick to a 5C. I mean, the governments and the corporations have lost all my trust, so it just depends on whether you think that's an important factor in your decision-making process or not. Sort of the last thing I want to touch on is Apple got back into accessories after having bumpers and docks with the 4 series. The 5 came out, with barely anything, and now we've got docks again, and more interestingly, we've got polka dot colors, maybe shades of the Dalmatian of years past, Peter, and we've got actual leather colors for the iPhone 5S.
Yeah, look, I don't like the gold one, I have to say, and the colored ones. Oh God, there are some definitely jarring combinations that you can do with the cutout cases for the iPhone 5C. But look, to each their own. Everybody loves to customize. A lot of people love to show off color. I just hope that anybody who is tacky enough to want an iPhone 5S in gold,
Hey,
covers it with one of those
No.
handsome leather covers. Just kidding, guys.
no, you're not, but I don't mind that either. Everyone has different tastes.
Yeah, the
So,
leather covers look really nice. And by the way, because the iPhone 5S has the exact same dimensions as the 5, those leather covers will work on a 5. I've gotten a lot of questions about that on Twitter and on our own forums. So if you saw those and you're like, well, I got an iPhone 5, I'm not willing to upgrade to the 5S right now, or I can't because I'm under contract, you can just pop one of those covers on and tell everybody you've got a 5S anyway.
all right, so I'm going to put you guys on the line now, and I'll do the same thing, but I'll start off with you, Peter. Who would you recommend an iPhone 5S for? Who would you recommend an iPhone 5C for? And who would you recommend the holdover iPhone 4S for?
Well, I think let me answer that in reverse order. The 4S is great for somebody who's on a budget, somebody who's looking to get into recent Apple technology like Siri, for example, but can't afford the best of everything. One of the downsides of the 4 is that you're not going to be able to get LTE. So if speed is an important consideration, and this is kind of particular to your carrier, Verizon in the United States has almost their entire network built out with LTE. AT&T is playing catch up. Sprint and T-Mobile are pretty far in the rearview mirror. But LTE may be an important consideration for a lot of people, especially in urban areas, which are getting LTE first. So if you want your phone to work as fast as possible, either the 5C or the 5S would be a good choice. I think the 5C is probably going to appeal more to young users, young adults, college students, and others who are looking for the capabilities of a 5. Maybe they've upgraded, maybe they're in the process of upgrading from an older iPhone, or maybe they're interested in trying an iPhone for the first time, but they don't necessarily need the best of everything. As far as the 5S is concerned, it's the new flagship phone from Apple. If you absolutely have to have everything that's the best, then the iPhone 5S is for you. It's the best iPhone that's out there. The one thing that I would warn people about is that some of the technology in the iPhone 5S, like the fingerprint, the Touch ID technology and the 64-bit processor and so forth, it's unproven stuff. So you're a little bit on the bleeding edge.
Richard, do you take issue with anything Peter said?
Not at all.
Damn it!
I would definitely. I would recommend the 4S in particular for first-time smartphone users. It's a couple of years old, but it's still a perfectly good smartphone. As Peter mentioned, you still get things like Siri, and over here you're going to be able to pick that up on some really good deals. It's obviously going to be free on contract in the States, but you'll be able to pick it up on some really competitive price plans over here in the UK. So it's definitely one to look out for the more casual user. Maybe if you're dipping your toe upgrading from a feature phone for the first time. It's definitely well worth a look. Again, with the other two, the 5S is going to attract more the people who are on the bleeding edge, or perhaps people who are literally just dropping into an upgrade cycle. If you got the 4S 2 years ago when that launched, then there's probably not much reason to not go for the 5S. If you're at the end of your contract, you're in that cycle, just do it. Drop the extra bit of cash and get the 5S. But the 5C is I think it's probably going to be the more mainstream model. It's fun, it's colourful, it is going to appeal to younger people, but that price difference is. It's maybe not as much as some people might have been hoping, but it will make a difference, especially when you're looking to buy it on contract.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you guys about the 4S. I mean, if you absolutely have to have an iPhone and you have absolutely no money, the 4S is an option. The thing that does LTE is a bit of a pain, but I think 8 gigabytes is going to just annoy so many people, because 16 gigabytes by itself, after a couple games, a movie or something, you're hitting that to the extent that you can't even download software updates. So I think the 8 gigabytes is going to be a deal breaker for a lot of people, and I would urge you, if at all possible, to save up the $99 and go up to the 5C. Also, because of future proofing. I mean, the 4 is going to get iOS 7, but it's going to get a very minimal build of iOS 7. It's going to have a lot of the great features and fancy stuff turned off. The 4S, if you get it now and you're on a 2-year contract, you almost certainly won't be getting updates for the life of that, and the ones you do get will be crippled. So if it's a difference between paying rent and putting food on the table, by all means get the iPhone you can afford. But if you can, go up to the 5C. That is a top of the line phone for mainstream people. It's as much smartphone as almost everybody needs. It's a little bit more resilient because of the plastic coating, and it's a great general purpose. Great. I'm not going to call it the millennials iPhone, but it's a great phone for first-time owners and for just general customers. And the 5S, if you want the future today, if you want all the cool technologies you've heard about or read about in sci-fi in your hand as soon as possible, you have that option. It's a couple extra $100. If you want 64 gigabytes, it's also your only choice. So if you really want all of Peter's music on your phone, you're going to have to go with the 5S.
And you're also going to need to cut my thumb off to get access to my Apple ID.
Don't tempt me, Frodo. So, Peter, you're on the record already, but 5S colors, what appeals to you, and 5C colors, what appeal to you?
The 5C colors I've taken a look at, and I have to say the yellow is calling me. I like the yellow. I don't know what it is about the yellow, but
it's not waterproof.
Yeah, but maybe it's I was hoping for a purple model, to be perfectly honest with you. If they had a purple model, that would have made me very happy. So maybe I can get a red and blue model and just wave them back and forth really fast at the same time. As far as the 5S is concerned, what are they calling it? Space gray?
Yes, I call it Boba Fett gray, but they call it space gray.
Right. Space gray, I think, is a very stately, handsome color. I like that a lot. That would be the one I would go with.
Nice, Richard. Is that British racing green on the 5C? I wasn't certain.
It's not. No, it's not even close. But
it's interstate battery green.
The green one is the one that attracts me the most. I can't really explain why, but it just grabbed me by the eyeballs and won't let go. So I'm really, really attracted to the green one. And in the 5S, it'd be between the gold or the grey ones. I have a white and silver iPhone 5 at the moment, and I like it a lot. I like the white front, but I'm quite drawn to the gold back, I have to say. But the space grey is a very, very attractive looking colour. Very attractive.
Yeah, I'm gonna get gold only because it looks different. It's something new. And Apple's never done gold before. Granted, they haven't done gray before either, but it's closer to black. I do like a lot of the new colors. I think that for the iPhone 5C, you have the option of yellow if you want something bright and shiny. The red is more pink than red, so it's not like a Ferrari. It's not quite as loud, but it's absolutely going to attract attention. Green is very down to earth. Blue is very up in the sky. So you have two great natural color options. And white is kind of the straight man. If you don't want any of the bright, shiny colors, you can get white, and it'll still be a very clean, crisp-looking phone. There's no black iPhone 5C, probably because that's the most the most in-demand colors, the most popular colors, so they want you to go high-end to get that. I'm guessing the 5S doesn't have black anymore because it's so hard to anodize and it was getting chipped and scratched, and gray is probably a lot more reliable color. But the entire palette looks great to me, and I think, Peter, if nothing else, it's a sign of the evolution and maturity of the iPhone platform, that they're doing what they did originally with the iPod.
Yeah, absolutely. Apple has been criticized, right or wrong, for taking last year's technology and just sticking it in a new case and selling it as something new. But I think that there's a lot to be said for that, because I think people are looking for an opportunity to buy something that they perceive as a good value. That still has novelty attached to it. And the one problem I think that they've had in the past is by knocking down last year's model as the cheaper phone, it gets kind of a bargain basement sort of appeal to it. All right, it's a good value, but it's still last year's thing. The iPhone 5C is still squarely this year's thing. So it certainly is going to, I think, sell by the boatload.
I agree with you. So, the next important question is, how much capacity do you get? At the low end, you have the 8 gigabyte iPhone 4S, which I still think is unmanageable. Then you have 16 gigabytes and 32 gigabyte for both the iPhone 5C and the iPhone 5S, and you have 64 gigabytes for the iPhone 5S. I used to say go big or go Amazon. I don't think I can say that anymore because I got a 64 gigabyte iPhone 5 and I've only ever used, about 30 odd gigabytes. I have a 16 gigabyte iPad 2, I think, and that thing is just always chock-a-block full. So I think the sweet spot for me is 32 gigabytes, and that's cheaper on the iPhone 5C. You get that for $199, where it's $299 for the iPhone 5S, but the iPhone 5S has more features. Whichever way you go, I'm going towards 32 gigabytes. Richard?
100% agree. I am fortunate enough in the UK to have a genuinely unlimited data plan. So in terms of music and things like that, it's all in the cloud. So I don't have to worry about downloading any of that. I get a great signal generally wherever I am. 16 isn't quite enough. I like my games. So I've got a couple of big racing games and that are kind of taking up a good bit of space. And even with the photographs as well, I've got sort of 2-3 gigs of photographs always on my iPhone at any one time. So I mean, I think that the 32 is a good middle ground, whichever one you're going for.
I think you make a good case. I think, to Peter's point earlier, if you have tons of music, tons of TV shows and movies, or you take a ton of 1080p video, I mean, I think like an hour of 1080p is about 10 gigs at this point, I think already. Peter, is there a case to be made for going to the maximum size?
There certainly is. Some people are going to need it because of the apps that they operate with, or the data that they want to have carried on their phone, or if they're heavy photographers or video users, and they don't want to dump photos out. They want to keep them in albums on their phone. The case could certainly be made for 64 gigs, but I think it's an edge case. I'm with you guys. I think 32 is the sweet spot. I've got a 16 gig iPhone 5, and it's a little scant for my taste. I have to dump unused apps every so often and, pull music that I don't want to hear anymore and replace it with other stuff to juggle that. 32 gives you enough elbow room that you can put what you want on your phone without having to worry about it. And 64 is there for people who really need it.
Yeah, it's definitely the high roller iPhone. Not high roller, but if you are the power user, you probably already know you're getting 64 bits, so we don't need to recommend it to you.
Yeah.
All right, so the big question is carriers then. You will be able to get an unlocked GSM phone. So if you want to pay full price, which goes up to, I think, $650, $750, and $850 for the iPhone 5S, $550, $650 for the iPhone 5C, $450 for the iPhone 4S. So you can absolutely get the phone and then pick your SIM later. But if you're looking for on-contract pricing, Peter, I'm going to let you go first because I think most of our listeners are based in the U.S. And it's going to be the classic question of AT&T versus Verizon versus Sprint versus T-Mobile.
That's right. You damn foreigners don't know what you're talking about there.
I think we lost Peter. Oh no, we're gonna have you go first, Richard. What's the UK look like?
Well, at the moment, very quiet. The four major carriers have all confirmed that they will be carrying the 5C and the 5S, which is no surprise at all. The biggest thing for us is that we now have LTE actually available when you go out and buy your new phone. So last year, when the 5 launched, you had the option of buying it on the EE network for when their LTE launched. Now we have 3 carriers that have an LTE option, with the 4th coming in December. So it becomes a viable choice, and that's going to be one of the bigger decisions to make, because you've got one carrier has generally better price structures and better coverage, and that's EE because they've been in the game for almost a year now. But O2 and Vodafone customers are not necessarily going to want to jump ship just to get LTE a little bit quicker. Pricing wise, it's going to vary. I mean, the 5C is $469 for the cheaper for the 16 gig model, sorry, and the 5S is $549 for the 16 gig model if you're going to buy them outright. And there's some great deals to be had on pay as you go, and some of the 30-day rolling contracts you can get from MVNO carriers. There's options out there for unlimited data. There's options out there for unlimited calls, texts, you name it. There's a lot to choose from, and there's some really good deals to be had. We're just waiting now for carriers to actually say how much they're going to charge us for the phone.
Our usual advice is always pick your carrier first. Ask your friends, ask your neighbors who they get the best reception with. Ask people at work, ask people at school if you go to school. The areas that you're in, find out who has the best service, because it doesn't matter how good your phone is if you can't connect to the internet and enjoy it. But do you have any sense? I mean, there are stereotypes in other markets, Richard. Are there stereotypes for who's faster, who's more reliable, who's more affordable in the UK market?
Definitely is. There has been for many a years. It always used to be Orange used to offer the best coverage, or they were accepted to offer the best coverage, and they've now rolled into what's now EE with T-Mobile. So they do have good coverage. They've got good, strong 3G coverage, and their LTE network covers more of the UK than any of the others. But the two other LTE networks launched about 2 weeks ago, so it's to be expected. There's kind of a misconception with 3, which is the smallest of our big 4 carriers, but it's one that prospective iPhone owners should really, really look at, because they offer a lot of unlimited data contracts, and it's properly unlimited. It's the one I use. I have a plan. I got an iPhone from them an iPhone 5 for free, and it gives me unlimited tethering, unlimited data, and more minutes and more minutes and text than I will ever use in my lifetime. So they're kind of overlooked by some people who have this misconception that because they only have a 3G network, they don't have anything below. So if it's either 3G or no G, which means sometimes the signal gets a little bit sort of sketchy, but they're already giving good data speeds with HSPA plus. The coverage is a lot better than people think it is, and it's always going to be one of the first carriers I would recommend people check out and see if they can use.
All right, so from the Canadian perspective, we're just buying time for Peter to come back and educate us on America. But from the Canadian perspective, we also have 3 big carriers. We have Rogers, we have Bell, and we have TELUS. Now, Bell and TELUS share the same network. They switched from CDMA like Verizon and Sprint in the U.S. to GSM like AT&T and T-Mobile in the U.S. because they wanted to be able to benefit from some of the more advanced technologies faster. So they share towers, but their backhaul is different. It's almost like sharing a Wi-Fi router, but having different internet connections going into it at the back. So that just means that you're going to have a different experience. Rogers probably has the most coverage, and it has some of the fastest LTE. They have giant, thick LTE pipes. I've gotten 65 gigabits down at the coffee shop, which is amazing, but they're expensive. Bell and TELUS, they're improving their coverage. I think Bell is right up there with Speed now. Bell can give you slightly more data at the same price. The only one has a 7 gigabyte plan option. But it really does matter, who has the best service, not just the best tower, but the best data behind that tower in your area. Each of those also owns a budget carrier. So Rogers owns Fido, Bell owns Virgin Mobile, and TELUS owns Kudu. There's also these upstart alternative carriers like Wind and Moblicity. Fido has announced the iPhone 5S and 5C, but we don't have much information yet. But Fido's usually, you can get a better plan on Fido than Rogers, even though it's the same network. Virgin has some of the cheapest rates. You have to buy your phone outright and then just get a SIM from them. But if you don't use a lot of stuff, it's a really cheap way to get in. So my general recommendation is if money is no object, go with Rogers. If money is the most important thing to you, then go with Virgin Mobile. You will have to buy the phone up front, but you'll end up paying much less overall. Peter, how's the U.S. market looking?
Well, they're the big 4, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, and Sprint, not necessarily in that order. Verizon's got the best coverage of any of them. AT&T is rapidly catching up. T-Mobile and Sprint are sort of the also-rans. T-Mobile is kind of the dark horse candidate. Their Un-carrier program has made it a lot less expensive to get these phones than they used to. But if you're in a major urban area, their LTE service is fast as blazes. At least that's been my personal experience. And part of it is because they don't have the same user base that AT&T and Verizon have to deal with. So you're not competing for spectrum with as many other people as you had to before. Sprint is Sprint. Sprint is growing its LTE footprint bit by bit, but just like T-Mobile, it's got a lot of distance to catch up before it can catch up with Verizon and AT&T.
So if someone comes up to you and they're like, everything is pretty much equal for me, Peter. All the carriers have great reception in my house, my office, my school. Would you recommend T-Mobile, or would you go with the stereotypical AT&T is the fastest, Verizon is the most reliable, and T-Mobile is the most affordable?
Absolutely, I would recommend T-Mobile. If all things were equal, I would tell customers, I would tell them first of all to go out and buy your phone instead of paying for it bit by bit through the carrier, which you can do, with T-Mobile very easily. You can do through Apple very easily. You end up paying a lot more on the front end, but you end up getting charged a lot less every month. For my T-Mobile plan, I pay less than half what I was paying AT&T. That tells you how badly they stick it to you when it comes to those subsidies.
Now, there's a couple other things to consider if you're in the U.S., and most of them have to do with the U.S.'s legacy CDMA networks. And you were getting this question a lot, right, Peter? Like, people want to know, can I finally use voice and data on a Verizon iPhone?
And the answer is no, unfortunately. And that's, it's kind of the immovable object meets the irresistible force. This is not a problem, an engineering problem that other cell phone manufacturers have let get in their way. Most of the other companies that Verizon does business with have phones that have dual antenna designs. One that lets you use voice it at one time, the other that lets you use data at the same time. The only problem is that this cuts down the battery life of the phone when you're doing both, because it's operating two different antennas at the same time. Apple didn't want to make any design compromises for Verizon, so just like every iPhone that's appeared on Verizon's network since the iPhone 4 came out, you're not going to be able to do simultaneous voice and data. Now, Verizon is talking about pushing voice over LTE or VoLTE out in 2014, and once that happens, we're going to start to see some phones come out that do voice over LTE. It's handled as a data packet just like everything else. So this isn't going to be an issue, but my bet is that you're going to have to buy a new iPhone to get that functionality.
Yeah, and just if people are wondering why this is the case, it's because LTE doesn't do simultaneous voice and data. No carrier does LTE with simultaneous voice and data. I think Richard pointed out that there's a Korean carrier that does VoLTE already, but standard LTE is just data. So what happens on a GSM phone is when a call comes in, LTE switches to HSPA, whether it's DCHSPA or HSPA Plus or whatever. So you're talking and you're doing HSPA data. Because there's no HSPA or GSM network on Verizon or Sprint, and because EVDO Rev A, which is what they use for data, can't do simultaneous voice or data either, you're just dropped off the internet unless you happen to be on Wi-Fi. So if that's really important to you, if your job or just your usage pattern necessitates simultaneous voice and data, it's something to consider before going with Verizon or Sprint. In other countries, the carrier situation is broadly similar. Europe tends to be, further behind North America when it comes to LTE. Asia tends to be way ahead of America when it comes to advanced telecommunications. So make sure you absolutely check with your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends, your family. Find out what works for them, and then test it out. I have a question specifically for you, Peter, because your weekend job, buying your iPhone. Does it make a difference whether you go to an Apple store, if you go to a carrier or a big box retailer, if you use maybe an online provider? Is there any general advice you'd give people about where to shop for their iPhone?
Well, wherever you buy your iPhone, if you're buying it through an authorized retailer, an authorized Apple retailer, save your receipt, because if you do need to go back to an Apple store for any reason to have the phone serviced, Apple will give you a really hard time. And this goes for people who buy stuff on the Apple Store online too. Save those receipts. I needed mine when I went into an Apple store to have my iPhone 5 replaced earlier this year, and it became a real sticking point because the Apple stores don't have access to Apple's online store sales information. So in terms of one over the other, some companies are offering some special deals right now, like Walmart, for example, is doing an in-store deal where you can get an iPhone 5C for $79 instead of $99, and an iPhone 5S for like $189 versus $199. Whether or not the $10 or $20 savings is worth going into Walmart, I leave to you to decide. But that's certainly an option for you. However, on a level playing field, Apple really does try to keep prices as close to the same as possible. So it shouldn't matter too much whether you buy it directly from Apple or go through a Verizon store, an AT&T store, or anywhere else that you want to get the phone.
Now, I usually recommend, again, civilians that they go to an Apple store because Apple will literally walk you hand in hand through the process. They'll help you buy it. They'll help you set it up. They will give you free classes on how to use it. So even if you're incredibly tech savvy, if you have a relative or a friend who wants to get the first iPhone and you don't want to become their iPhone babysitter, you can easily hand that job off to an Apple store. Also, they have the Genius Bar right there, and if you have any problems with it, they will help you fix those problems, usually very easily.
There's one other consideration too, Rene, that I just wanted to point out, and I don't know if things have changed in the past couple of years, but the last time I bought an iPhone at a non-Apple store, trying to get Apple Care Plus on it was a real problem. If you don't do that, you do have 30 days from the time that you purchase the phone to get Apple Care Plus, but it does mean that you're going to have to find an Apple retail store to go to in order to get it, because they actually have to physically examine the phone and make sure that it's coverable under the Apple Care Plus warranty coverage.
Now, that was going to be my last question. I always get Apple Care and now Apple Care Plus because it's available because I am clumsy. I will drop my phone. My iPhone 4S was hit by, or 5, I forget which one, was hit by fireworks and it melted the oleophobic coating and Apple changed it for me. I've dropped them. I've broken screens. I've had them chipped. I had all sorts of things happen. So I usually almost always end up having to get my iPhone exchanged, if not once, maybe twice. So to me, the $99, I think it's actually $79 cost now, which doubles the warranty, brings it to 2 years, and has I think the deductible's gone up though now as well. I forget what the deductible is. Peter, do you know what the current deductible is for Apple Care Plus?
I don't. I'm sorry.
I think it's I think it's $99 or something. It was $49. Anyway, you pay a deductible and you can get a new phone basically at a hugely reduced cost. So I personally get it, and unless you're like an Ali Kazmuha level ninja who can replace her own screens, while riding a unicycle, I think I think the value outweighs the cost. Richard, do you have any insurance experience?
No, I really should, especially given how clumsy I am with phones. But no, it's not something I've really ever looked at. I think Apple Care Plus has only just sort of made its way across to us anyway. We're kind of far-flung part of the world, but I mean there are ways. It's like over here, certain home insurance providers, for example, will cover mobile phone damage as well. So it's always, even if you don't go out and purchase something like specific mobile phone insurance or Apple Care, it's always worth if you have home insurance, it's always worth speaking to your provider and seeing if they will cover phone damage as well.
That brings up another good point as well. Most of the carriers, at least in the U.S., offer some kind of either upgrade program or insurance that is either designed to replace Apple Care Plus or supplement it. So as you're shopping around, look carefully at those plans. It may turn out that something like T-Mobile's Jump plan, for example, which will allow you not only to trade in a broken phone and get a big discount on replacing it, but will also allow you to upgrade your phone after a certain period of time. Some of these new programs, upgrade programs that the carriers are offering are actually replacing or supplementing their insurance programs. They're definitely worth looking at and comparing and figuring out, based on your own usage characteristics and what you expect, where your money should be spent.
It's $79 now, according to Farbod, who used to actually write for iMore, who's joining us in the chat room today. Hi, Farbod. Is the new exchange price. To Peter's point, there's also often, if you buy it at a big box retailer, you might have points, which you can put towards your purchase, or some sort of loyalty program involved, and they might have their own specific care packages. I'm not always thrilled with carrier or retailer care packages. There's also things like Square Trade, which goes even beyond what an Apple insurance policy does. It's more expensive, but for example, if you use your iPhone to stop bullets or to protect yourself from hail, it might be something that you want to look into. That's generally all the advice I can think of when it comes to the iPhone. The last bit I will say is this. some people still aren't sure. They look over all the information, and instead of it being helpful, it just starts to feel overwhelming. So my advice is, close your eyes and imagine an iPhone in your hand. Imagine what it looks like. Imagine which one it is. Get as clear a picture as you can, and then buy that. And remember that you generally have up till 2 weeks. Depends, on your jurisdiction and what the local laws are. But you usually have up to 2 weeks or a certain amount of usage when you can still return the phone. So figure out which one you want, go and get it, and if for any reason you're disappointed, put it through its paces quickly and urgently, and then go and exchange it if you need to. Peter, any final buying advice from you?
Not really, no. I think we've really covered the gamut. I can't think of anything that we've left off the table. The only thing that I would say would be whichever phone that you go with, get some kind of protection for it, some kind of case. As you mentioned, Rene, I my weekend job, I work at an Apple specialist, and we get people coming in all the time who knew that they should have kept their phone in a case and didn't, and end up with smashed screens or whatever. It's just not worth the trouble. A case is inexpensive, and if it gives you a little bit of extra protection, it's worth it.
Awesome. Richard?
I've just something just came to mind from our from when we sort of had the lineup parties for the iPhone 5 last year. I seem to remember Kevin Mitchelluk up in whichever part of Canada it is he's from. I forget.
I think he was in Miami last year, actually.
Oh, was it? But I seem to recall it might have been a previous one, but he was describing the queue of however many hundreds of people queuing up to go and buy the new iPhone from the Apple Store. They all went left to the Apple Store. He went right to the Rogers Store and was first in line. Yep. So maybe it's something to, if you're not changing carrier, maybe it's something to bear in mind. Your carrier store is probably going to be a lot less busy next Friday than the Apple Store.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter Cohen, where can we find more of you and more of your writing?
On iMore at The Loop, loopinsight.com, on Twitter at Flarg, F-L-A-R-G-H, and pretty much everywhere else, too.
Richard Devine?
I am usually found on iMore during the day, occasionally elsewhere on Mobile Nations, on Twitter at Ricka666, and search for my name on Google+.
You can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find me on iMore.com. You can find all of our shows at Mobile Nations. And if you still have questions, if you have concerns, we have a full written buyer's guide. We went through everything that we talked about on the show and more. It's going to be up on iMore. Just go to imore.com/iPhone and you will find it there. You will also find links to our forums. We have forums for the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 5C filled with experts who can really help you make a good decision and help you with your device, your iPhone, whatever you choose to get after the decision. It really is the best community at mobile. And speaking of which, I want to thank our chat room. You guys are awesome as usual. We only sound smart because you give us all the answers about 10 seconds before we speak them. So if you have not listened to the show live yet, then you have not heard Shakespeare the way it was meant to be played, and we welcome you to join us pretty much every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. British Summer Time, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody, and good evening.
Bye, folks.
Good night.